Today, colleagues, you're going to hear a revolutionary hypothesis for the cause of macular degeneration. This is a hypothesis which holds that macular degeneration is not only entirely preventable, but that it may be treatable in the early and moderate stages with ancestral diets. So what I'm going to show you today is that just 100 years ago and prior, macular degeneration was an extremely rare disorder. And today, it is of epidemic proportions in developed nations worldwide. And the only thing that's changed that can account for that is our diet. Genetics and aging, as you will see, cannot possibly explain the increasing prevalence of AMD that we see today. So, you all know that AMD is the leading cause of irreversible vision loss and blindness in people over the age of 65 worldwide. In fact, nearly 1 in 3 adults over the age of 75 now has AMD and has had since 1992. Globally, 1 of 11 adults over the age of 50 now has some degree of AMD. 15 million Americans thought to have been affected with AMD back in 1994. 196 million people with AMD worldwide is the anticipation by 2020, so we're really close to that number. The World Health Organization tells us that there were 2 million people blind due to AMD, both eyes, as of 2002, so I think that's closer to 3 million people today. 20,000 people will be diagnosed with macular degeneration today, and tomorrow, and the day after that. Today, it is 20,000 per day. But what do you suppose the lifetime risk of developing AMD was back in the year 1900? The answer to that is nearly 0. 1 in many thousands, and I'll try to convince you of that with a little bit of data in the very limited time that we have. But if AMD was a medical rarity just 100 years ago, and today it affects nearly 1 in 3, we have to ask ourselves why. What changed to induce that? So we all know what AMD can do to the vision, but the question really today is this difference due to diet and diet alone? And after 7 years of studying this, I believe the answer is that it is all about diet. And there's no question that genetics makes us susceptible, but it is diet that pulls the trigger. Now, let's talk about ancestral diets versus westernized diets very quickly. So an ancestral diet is any diet that existed anywhere on the planet before 1880. Why 1880? Because up until then, the only foods we had anywhere on the planet were what you see here. Meat, fowl, fish, fruits, vegetables, grains, nuts, seeds, and dairy, essentially. All diets everywhere on the planet began with these foods. We didn't have any man-made processed foods in the form of refined white flour, vegetable oils, and trans fats. We had sugar, but in small quantities. So today, you know that the westernized diet looks a lot like this, right? There are 600,000 food items that you can put on the plate today here in the US. But let me break this down for us, because what's on this plate, 63% of what's on this plate is made up of 4 refined, processed, nutrient-deficient foods in the form of sugar, refined white flour, added polyunsaturated vegetable oils, and trans fats. And these foods replaced and supplanted nutrient-dense foods. Now, for decades, we've all seen some version of this statement in our textbooks and journals. The etiology of AMD is unknown, right? We don't know exactly what causes it. If we did, we might be able to prevent it. In 2012, Joan Miller, who's the chief and chair at Mass Eye and Ear, made this statement, quote, "It seems that AMD is a complex disease that results from the interaction of genetic susceptibility with aging and environmental factors." I think this is a really fair statement to sum up what we believe about the etiology of AMD today. And I want you to notice, of course, that environmental factors is always listed as a third and diminutive factor, with diet being a really small part of that. This paper that came out in 2016 from Bascom Palmer regarding the genetics of AMD made this statement: currently, 52 gene variants have been significantly associated with macular degeneration. And then this: the genetic component of AMD has been estimated at 45 to 70%. Anybody know what's wrong with this kind of thinking? The problem is that faulty genes don't result in epidemics of disease. And this was well put in a paper by David Grimes, Blackburn Royal Infirmary, in this paper about the epidemic of coronary heart disease, when he said this, quote, "It is obvious that an epidemic cannot be due to faulty genes which have a stable prevalence over a long period of time. However, genes can have an influence on susceptibility." This is exactly the case with macular degeneration. Genes set us up, but environment pulls the trigger. Now, after studying nutrition for a couple of years, back in 2013, I developed this hypothesis. It goes like this. The displacing foods of modern commerce are the primary and proximate cause of AMD. And the corollary to this hypothesis is this. Any ancestral diet will prevent and may treat existing AMD. Now, displacing foods of modern commerce, just think of that as processed foods, and we'll come back to that. This is published in this paper. We published this in November of last year in the journal Medical Hypotheses. I've left it a copy for most of you there. If you didn't get one, there are more in the back. Make sure that you get one. But this talk is fundamentally based on this paper. Now, let's go back to this hypothesis. The displacing foods of modern commerce are the primary and proximate cause of AMD. I didn't come up with this term, displacing foods of modern commerce. That came from this man, Weston A. Price. Now, for those of you who don't know him, Weston Price is considered the father of nutrition amongst thousands of nutrition researchers worldwide. Why? Because Weston Price was a highly accomplished scientist, researcher, and dentist who in the 1930s spent the better part of that decade traveling the world, evaluating people on 5 continents, 14 nations, hundreds of tribes and villages, and thousands upon thousands of people as they transitioned from native traditional diets over to westernized diets. And what Price set out to discover was, what was it about diets that led to dental health and good physical health, and what, on the contrary, led to dental decay and physical degeneration. And what Price found, first of all, no matter where he went on 5 continents, was people that looked like this. These were fantastically healthy, happy, vibrant people with incredibly straight, natural, beautiful teeth, more than 99% cavity-free, and these people had immunity to our chronic degenerative diseases like heart disease, hypertension, type 2 diabetes, stroke, cancers, arthritis, as long as they consumed their native traditional diets. But as soon as these people began to consume what Price called the displacing foods of modern commerce, which he defined as refined white flour, sugar, canned goods, sweets, confectionery, and vegetable oils, when they consumed these foods, the next thing that happened was dental decay, like these 2 ladies on the left. And then this was followed by degenerative conditions like arthritis, cancer, and loss of immunity to infectious diseases like tuberculosis. So, now Price called these primitive diets that these people were on, and there were actually dozens, maybe hundreds of them. First of all, macronutrient ratios, the ratios of proteins to carbs to fats, made no difference whatsoever. What mattered was micronutrient density, the density of vitamins and minerals in the food. These were all diets of plant and animal origin that kept these people healthy, and they all contained sacred foods. Sacred foods are very rich in the fat-soluble vitamins, A, D, and K2 primarily, and they were in foods like liver and fish eggs, for example. None of these diets contained processed foods that kept these people healthy. So Price took thousands of samples of these foods from all over the world, and he sent them back to his labs in the US for analysis, and what he found was that these native traditional diets contained 10 times as many fat-soluble vitamins, A, D, and K2, 4 times as many water-soluble vitamins, which is all the B vitamins and C, and 1.5 to 60 times more minerals than did the American diets of his day, and that was the 1930s, and I assure you, we have far more processed food available today. So, since Price's day, thousands of researchers and papers have further made this connection between processed foods and diseases of Western civilization. All these diseases, heart disease, cancers, type 2 diabetes, stroke, the list goes on and on and on. And this is very well accepted by ancestral and primal paleo-type nutrition researchers around the world. People like S. Boyd Eaton, Lauren Cordain, Chris Masterjohn, Stefan Guillenet, the list goes on. In fact, what I would submit to you is that this concept should be considered canonical theory in medicine. We shouldn't even have to question that this relationship exists between processed foods and all of this disease. So I understood all this in 2013. And then I asked the question, could AMD be another disease of Western civilization? Might it be a disease that follows processed food consumption? So, well, the prevalence of AMD would help answer that, right? So let's look at the prevalence of AMD historically. So in 2013, I asked myself these two questions. Was AMD always so prevalent? In fact, when could ophthalmologists even see the macula? I had no idea in 2013. Turns out ophthalmologists could see the macula in 1851, beginning in 1851, because of the genius of Hermann von Helmholtz. So von Helmholtz was the German-born physician and physicist who designed the ophthalmoscope. This is his original design, and he published this design in 1851, and this technology spread rapidly around the world. So within a decade, the ophthalmoscope was in use all around the world. In fact, by 1855, ophthalmologists had begun to produce atlases of the retina that looked like this. And there's a number of these atlases. And in fact, these are being stored at the Royal College of Ophthalmologists Museum in London, England. The honorary curator there, Richard Keeler, informs me they don't have an image of macular degeneration in this historical library. The most common condition we see in the retina today, at least in the posterior pole, and they don't have one from the 19th century. Why? In fact, 23 years would go by after the ophthalmoscope was released before this man, Jonathan Hutchinson, London, England, would describe AMD for the first time, 1874. He described 4 cases that he had collected from his practice in London. 1895, German ophthalmologist Otto Hobb published a paper in which he'd evaluated 50,000 ophthalmic patient medical records and determined that AMD was as rare as traumatic maculopathy and myopic maculopathy. And I think we all know how rare those are. By 1920, there were 4.9 million Americans over the age of 65 in the US. We know this from the Social Security database. If the prevalence of AMD in 1920 was the same as 1990, which was 22.8%, we know this from the Beaver Dam Eye study, then there should have been 1.1 million people with AMD in the US in 1920 if we only consider those over age 65. And yet, between 1851 and 1920, there was no more than about 50 cases of AMD in all the world's literature. Ophthalmologists had been using ophthalmoscopes since the 1850s. They had 86 versions by 1880. They had over 200 models or versions by 1913. They had been using dilating drops since the 1860s. They used 6 different dilating drops by the 1880s, and this is all well documented. 1927, Sir Stuart Duke Elder entered the picture. He published this textbook. This is my copy. It's called Recent Advances in Ophthalmology. 340 pages, comprehensive textbook of ophthalmology. 15 pages he dedicated to retinal examination and disease. Not a single reference to macular degeneration. Didn't even use the term or anything related to it. But 13 years later, in his next textbook of ophthalmology in 1940, he dedicated 13 pages to the condition of macular degeneration, 17 images, 6 of which were in full color, and he called macular degeneration a common cause of failure in central vision in old people. So in 1927, I don't think he knew what macular degeneration was, but by 1940, it was becoming a common cause of failure in vision. If we jump ahead to the Framingham Study in 1975, 8.8% of those over age 52 now have AMD, and 27.9% of those 75 and above have the disease. Now we have an epidemic. Over 4 million people affected by that year. The question is, why? What happened? What induced this? So let's look at the diet, because what happened in the US sort of followed in the rest of the developed world. So 4 processed nutrient-deficient foods have changed the world's diet forever. First, refined and added sugars. Sugars have been increasing for centuries, but today occupy 21% of the US diet. It's a nutrient-deficient food. Second, refined white wheat flour. Currently, wheat is 20% of global calories. 85% of that in the US is refined, meaning it's nutrient deficient. Third, polyunsaturated vegetable oils, introduced in 1880 for the first time with cottonseed oil. Currently, 24% of U.S. calories. These oils replaced and supplanted the animal fats, lard, butter, and beef tallow, which kept us healthy through millennia. Fourth, artificially created trans fats. Currently about 0.85% of U.S. calories. These were introduced in 1911 by Procter & Gamble with Crisco. So, put those four foods together, and this comes from our own USDA. The yellow slice of our edible pie there, 63% of the American diet made up of processed food. And if you can see down there on the left, they list it: added vegetable oils, trans fats, sugars, and refined grains. Why does the USDA list this? Because they know this is a disaster for us metabolically and physically. That's why they list it this way. Nutrition researchers around the world make this connection. The world is shifting rapidly towards a diet linked with non-communicable diseases. All these diseases I'm talking about, all the metabolic and degenerative diseases, right? So, now you're going to see that macular degeneration follows processed food consumption worldwide. Now, we did what nutrition researchers do. We tracked proxy markers for processed foods in the form of, first, sugar. Why sugar? Because it's in 74% of the 600,000 food items available in the U.S. It's 21% of the food supply. And and vegetable oils, which is 24% of the U.S. food supply. It's in hundreds of thousands of foods, no doubt. We believe this will track around 90% or more of processed food. So let's see what happens when we track these. So this is the United States, and you're going to see that sugar consumption tracked way back to 1840 all the way to today. And look at in the blue there, and down in the bottom, the total vegetable oils in black, which really began in 1880 but sort of took off in 1909. You can see that by 2010, we're at 80 grams a day. 80 grams of vegetable oil per person per day. Now look at the green bars. That's the macular degeneration prevalence, which shows epidemic proportions in the 1970s. But let me go back here, because if we look way back here at way back in here, we know that in 1900 we had no AMD. We had virtually none. By the 1930s, right in here somewhere, we had some. By the 1970s, we're at epidemic proportions and probably rising. Now, what we see, and we have data in 25 nations, is that 30 plus years of consuming these foods at these levels, and you'll start to see epidemic proportions of AMD. That's the point. This is Japan. Japan is the quintessential nation to illustrate this point, because their epidemic occurred in a lot of our own lifetimes. All right, their sugar consumption rose from 1961 on the left up to about 80 to 90 grams a day. Not so interesting. But look at their harmful vegetable oils. That's the polyunsaturates down there in red. It's at 9 grams a day back here in 1961, elevated 4.5-fold to 40 grams a day by the early 2000s. Now look at their macular degeneration prevalence in green. 0.2% in the late 1970s, 11.4% by 2007. A 57-fold increase in the prevalence of AMD in 30 years. Now, we cannot possibly explain that with genetics and aging. In fact, any hypothesis you want to proffer for the etiology of AMD needs to explain this kind of data. And this is not the only nation that looks this way. The diet explains it. They westernized their diet. This is Nigeria. This is 100% African population. Notice their sugar consumption in the blue, really low, and their harmful vegetable oil consumption down there in the red, also very low. And over here at 2004, they had an AMD prevalence of 3.2%. Now that pales in comparison to our 22.8%, and it should, because they consume far less processed foods. But this gets a lot more interesting. If you look at this little tiny blip over here, in 2007, that's a prevalence of AMD of 0.1%. Now let me explain. The 3.2% in 2004, that's in Onitsha, Nigeria. There they have access to processed foods. They have grocery stores. All right? The 2007 study with the 0.1% prevalence of AMD, that was in southwestern rural Nigeria. Guess what they don't have access to there? grocery stores or any form of processed food. They're consuming a native traditional diet. They can't get our foods. So keep this in mind, 0.1% prevalence of AMD in this African population in southwestern rural Nigeria who can't get processed foods as we look at this slide. This is Barbados. The indigenous people of Barbados are of Western African descent. In this study, this is a nearly 97% African population. Barbados is known amongst nutrition researchers around the world as a mecca for processed food consumption. Why? Because they import almost all of their food. Importing food almost always means processed foods. You can tell. Look at their sugar consumption, 140 plus grams a day since the 1960s. Their vegetable oil consumption, approaching 20 grams a day, down there in the red, approaching 20 grams a day and rising, but is actually underreported in this. But let me tell you, with all this processed food consumption, the people of Barbados have a, quote, world profile of metabolic disease, metabolic syndrome, type 2 diabetes, obesity, heart disease, cancer, all that. Of course they would. That's where all this comes from. Now, look at their macular degeneration prevalence, 24.3%, 243 times greater than the Africans of southwestern rural Nigeria who can't get processed food. I mean, does anybody want to argue this is about genetics and aging? Next, this is the Solomon Islands in the South Pacific. Notice their sugar consumption, about 20-ish grams a day since the 1960s, and then down at the very bottom in red, notice their vegetable oil consumption, zero, the polyunsaturated vegetable oils, zero since 1961. Why? They don't get them. Big food manufacturers don't sell them down there. Now, these people are consuming mostly a native traditional diet. Look at their macular degeneration. The ophthalmologists that collaborated with us down there tell us that their AMD prevalence about 0.2% from 2005 to 2015. They see about, each ophthalmologist there sees an AMD patient about once every 2 to 3 months. But you can see the difference. Next, Kiribati. This is the last nation I'll show you. Kiribati is an island nation 1,200 miles south of Hawaii, 115,000 population. They have one ophthalmologist. Look at their sugar consumption, pretty high, 80, up towards of 120 grams since over the last 5 decades. But look at their harmful vegetable oils, zero. Once again, they don't get them. They're living off of a native traditional diet. What they consume primarily is seafood, root vegetables, and coconut oil. The tropical saturated oils are great, just like monounsaturated olive oils. It's the polyunsaturated oils that are a disaster. All right, now, way over here on the right, look at their macular degeneration, 0.2%. They have one ophthalmologist for a population of 115,000 people. In 2015, he saw 2 patients with macular degeneration, 2 for the year. In conclusion, AMD was a medical rarity from 1851 to 1930. 1970s were epidemic proportions. 2018, today, about 190 plus million people affected. But what changed? Displacing foods of modern commerce are what changed. Now we have evidence for proximate cause because with our data in 25 nations, the processed foods always come first, then the AMD hits. The temporal relationship, 30 plus years, you've seen it. There's a dose-response relationship. You've seen that as well. 0.1% prevalence of AMD in the Africans of southwestern rural Nigeria who can't get processed foods. 24.3% prevalence of AMD in the Africans of Barbados who live almost exclusively on processed foods. If you look at our data in 25 nations, I think you'll come to the same conclusion I have. This relationship is nearly a mathematical certainty. The polyunsaturated vegetable oils deserve special mention. These are the greatest contributor to AMD. I have no question. They are biological poisons, and this is well known amongst researchers all around the world. In my opinion, these are the single greatest contributor to irreversible blindness in AMD. But the big picture, colleagues, is this: displacing foods of modern commerce lead to macular degeneration. So I'd like you to ask yourselves, does this hypothesis have validity? Is this worth exploring further? No, we can't prove it. The incubation period for macular degeneration is probably 40 plus years, just like heart disease and Alzheimer's and all these, many of these other chronic degenerative diseases. This, ladies and gentlemen, is God-given food. This is what leads to health and to healthy eyes. This is processed foods. These are the displacing foods of modern commerce. These lead to metabolic disease, degenerative diseases, and macular degeneration. Today, 270 people will go blind due to macular degeneration. They'll lose vision in their second eye due to AMD. I believe it's all preventable. For more information, come to our website, Cure AMD Foundation. We are a 501c3 nonprofit organization. We're located at cureamd.org. We give away all the information. We give away the books for the cost of printing. And I want to thank you for your attention. I want to thank the COS, and I want to thank all of you. It's been an honor and a pleasure. Thank you.
I was kind of looking up things as you were going through there, and I Googled when processed flour was first. Processed sugar was created in 510 BC, and due to people's wealth and so forth, it wasn't widely used. But as the country has become more wealthy, people can afford more of the sugars. I think your presentation was great. But something else that closely mimicked that was flour. Like flour. Because I came about, the bleached processed flour came about in the 1900s. That's when that first started. So it'd be interesting to see how that plots on the graph as well.
Yeah, it's a great question, and we'd love to do that. The problem is that refined white flour was introduced in 1880 and has been climbing ever since. And as I said, 85% of our wheat consumption in the United States is refined. But the problem with tracking it, which I think is still a decent idea, is that you can't prove what's refined and what's not. So you don't know who's consuming the whole grains, which are nutrient dense, and who's consuming the refined grains, which, when you remove the bran and the germ, you remove the B vitamins, E vitamins, fiber, minerals, omega-3 and omega-6 fatty acids. So now you have a nutrient-deficient food. But let's face it, 85% of the wheat and grains consumed in the U.S. are refined, and so they're nutrient-deficient foods.
So Chris, I have a couple of difficult questions for you, tough questions that I've tried to answer in my own mind as you've been talking. And one is that in 1900, the average lifespan of an American was around 50. And by the time Medicare came out, the average lifespan was 66. And now it's somewhere around 80, 85. And so, in being in retinal practice for 32 years, I almost never saw anyone with macular degeneration before age 75. So if you look at it in that manner, you could almost take a different conclusion, and that the modern diet has made people live 20 years longer, and that the expression of macular degeneration is totally related to how old you are, which is kind of what I would consider. And you were also using examples of African people, and in my practice in 32 years, I bet I saw 2 African background people with wet macular degeneration, and 99+% were all white people. And so those are tough questions to answer, and what do you have to say about that?
Yeah, great question. Well, number one is that there's a huge difference between average lifespan and expected lifespan. So the expected lifespan has been shown in many studies that we've lived for 70, 80 plus years, for many centuries, probably millennia, as long as you don't die early of infectious diseases, trauma, warfare, things like that. In the year 1800, 43% of children did not see their 5th birthday. Wasn't much better in 1900. 36% of children in the year 1900 worldwide did not see their 5th birthday. In 1900, in Switzerland, 22% of children did not see their 5th birthday, I believe was the number. So even in developed nations, many children died very early. 4% of women died in childbirth in the year 1900. And so those things brought the average lifespan way down. But for people who survived infections and all that, survived childhood, the average lifespan has been in the 70s. Our first 8 U.S. presidents lived to an average age of 78. Today, the average man lives to 76. So lifespan has been in the 70s or 80ish or so for millennia. And I think that's really the answer to that. That's also the reason I showed the slide where in 1920 there was 4.9 million Americans over the age of 65. So we can't argue that, well, they just didn't live long enough. We had we had almost 5 million people in the U.S. in 1920 over the age of 65. And we should have had 1.1 million people with AMD if we only consider the people over age 65. But there was no more than about 50 cases of AMD in all the world's literature at that point. Well, I think part of the answer is that we have to look at an example like Barbados, where the processed food consumption is really high. I don't have any doubt at all that the Africans are not as genetically susceptible as we are. There is no question. Their prevalence of AMD, population for population, runs probably around half of what ours would be. But in Barbados, 97% African population and 24.3% of them above age, I think it was 53, had AMD. So they can develop extremely high prevalences of macular degeneration.
By optometrists or ophthalmologists back then, and maybe not everybody had access to equipment, but still I think that there's a lot of validity to what you have.
Well, there was 6 ophthalmoscopes in use by 1880, and by 1880, 6 different dilating agents in use. Fuchs covered this extremely well in 1889, and I've read all of these texts, not all of them, but most of these textbooks from the 19th century that are available. And I would say that as clinicians, the ophthalmologists of the 19th century make us look pathetic. We rely on fundus cameras and OCTs and all of that. They relied on their powers of observation, and they gave amazing descriptions of macular degeneration. Fuchs' textbook of 1889, translated into English in 1892, would rival anything that we have available today in their description. And I'd say a number of clinicians were exactly like that. They weren't missing it, ladies and gentlemen. They weren't missing it. Their descriptions are very solid. And they reviewed all kinds of retinal conditions in the 19th century. But macular degeneration was rarely there. Yes? Right, but I think the great example here is Otto Hobb's analysis of the 50,000 ophthalmic patient medical records in 1895. And he determined AMD was as rare as traumatic maculopathy and myopic maculopathy. So it's hard to argue with that as well.
Thank you very much. Great questions.